I have told this story exactly once before, to a Surath Corridor arbitration board, under oath, with a recorder running and 3 lawyers in the room who kept trying to interrupt me. I told it then the way a man tells a thing when he knows the telling is the last defense he has. I am telling it again now, 20 years later, because someone should have it whole, not the arbitration summary, not the Meridian counterfiling, not the version that ran in the colonial press with Thresh referred to throughout as the way station operator, as though I were a piece of equipment that malfunctioned. My name is Davin Thresh. I ran Haverock Way Station for 11 years. I am 61 years old. I have a bad knee, a functional coffee habit, and a daughter I am inordinately proud of, though she would tell you I never say so directly, which is fair. I am going to tell you about the 3 days in the winter of my 41st year that rearranged everything I thought I knew about what I was. Start at the container. Haverock Way Station sat, I suppose, since it has been substantially rebuilt since, on the cold margin edge of the Surath Corridor, in a section of space that the colonial authority had been arguing over for 40 years without resolution. Legally ambiguous territory is the polite phrase. What it meant in practice was that the station operated under a patchwork of 3 overlapping charter systems, none of which fully recognized the others, and that whoever arrived with the most confident paperwork generally got what they wanted. I had been running the place for 11 years when any of this happened. Before that, I spent 19 years as a colonial infrastructure surveyor, measuring rock and ice and soil composition for resource licensing boards who used my measurements to grant extraction rights to companies I never met. It was precise work. It required almost no conversation. I was very good at it. I came to Haverock because the survey work ran out, or rather, I ran out before the work did. My back gave in on a Vithran ice field when I was 38, and the colonial authority gave me a medical administrative reassignment rather than a pension because that was cheaper. Haverock was the reassignment. A way station on the cold margin that processed approximately 47 cargo transits a month, maintained a population of 6 permanent staff and rotating contractors, and generated just enough revenue to justify its own existence without generating enough to attract real corporate interest. It was, in the colonial authority's estimation, a way station that could be run by a man with a bad back and no ambition for advancement. They were not wrong about either condition. I liked Haverock. I want to say that plainly because some accounts of what happened there imply that I was miserable and desperate, and that the child somehow rescued me from my own unhappiness. That is sentimental nonsense. I was not unhappy. I was contained. There is a difference. I had my routines, my manifest logs, my maintenance schedules, my twice-weekly communication bursts to the Colonial Authority Regional Office. I had Petra, my second-in-command, who was 26 and competent, and who managed the fuel line operations with more precision than I had managed them at her age. I had Solt and Marin, who ran the cargo bay, and Yusuf, who kept the atmospheric processors functional through sheer force of stubbornness, and old Cassidy, who had been at Haverock longer than I had and who ran the commissary and never, in 11 years, gave me a straight answer about anything. I had 6 people and a station and a life that fit the shape I had made for it. I was not looking for it to change. The container arrived on a Tuesday, which I know because I still have the transit manifest in a physical binder on the shelf behind me as I write this. It came in on the Vithran freighter Ondrax line, registered out of Sector 14 under a Class C commercial hauling license. Cargo description: geological core samples, survey batch reference 7741C, consignee listed as Haverock Way Station Transit Hold, final destination Surath Central Processing Depot. Nothing unusual. We processed 47 transits a month. Geological cores came through regularly. The Surath Corridor has several active survey contracts, and Haverock's Transit Hold is a standard intermediate stop on 3 of the approved routing corridors. Solt signed the container in. He logged it at Bay 7, which is where we staged anything marked for onward transit without inspection, standard procedure for sealed geological survey batches, which are handled under a different protocol than general cargo because the seals are survey integrity certified, and breaking them before delivery constitutes a liability issue. I did not look at the container on Tuesday. I would not have looked at it on Wednesday either, except that Marin came to find me in the manifest room at 3:40 on Wednesday morning and told me the atmospheric processor in Bay 7 was throwing temperature variance alerts. I want to be precise about this, because the Meridian lawyers later tried to make something of the timing, as though I had somehow known what was in the container and had deliberately staged events to manufacture a discovery. Let me be plain. Yusuf had been fighting Bay 7's processor since October. The cold margin means Haverock runs in exterior temperatures that would freeze exposed water in 11 seconds, and the Bay heating systems cycle hard to compensate. Bay 7's processor had a compromised tertiary heat exchanger that Yusuf had been patching for 6 weeks, while we waited on a replacement part that kept getting bumped from the supply manifests. The temperature variance alert on that Wednesday morning was the 4th such alert in 6 weeks. It was not connected to the container. It was connected to a heat exchanger that needed replacing. I went to Bay 7 at 3:40 because it was my job. I had my thermal reader, my maintenance log, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I ran the diagnostic on the processor. I identified that the tertiary exchanger had dropped below operational threshold again, and that the Bay temperature had spiked to 4.2 degrees above ambient, not a crisis, but worth logging. I noted it, flagged Yusuf for a morning follow-up, and was turning to leave when I heard the sound. I am going to describe it as accurately as I can. It was not a human sound. It was not a sound I recognized from any of the alien species I had worked alongside in my surveying years, and that is a longer list than most people carry, because survey work takes you to margins where the established species catalogs are still catching up to what actually lives there. It was a high, thin sound, not loud, wavering at the top of its register the way a signal does when the transmission is breaking up. It came from Bay 7, from the row of containers staged for onward transit. I stood still for what I estimate was about 10 seconds. Then I walked to the row and I followed the sound. It was coming from the geological survey container. Batch reference 7740-1C consignee Haverock Way Station Transit Hold. I need to be honest about what I did next, because I have told this story in public and in legal depositions, and there is a version of it in which I am a hero of immediate and decisive action. That version is inaccurate. What I actually did was stand in front of that container for nearly 4 minutes, holding my thermal reader, listening to that thin wavering sound, and running through the liability protocols in my head. A sealed survey container. Survey integrity certified seals. Breaking the seals before delivery is a liability issue. I did not know what was inside it. I did not know that it was anything beyond a geological core batch with a cracked seal that had emitted some atmospheric leak that was now producing a resonance effect in the samples. That was a possible explanation. It was a remote possible explanation, because geological cores do not generally produce sounds. But I was a man who had spent 30 years believing in protocols, and protocols say you do not break survey seals. I broke the seal. I broke it because the sound changed while I was standing there. It dropped in pitch and went ragged at the edges and became something that I could not locate in my inventory of known mechanical or atmospheric sounds. It became something that made the hair on the back of my forearm stand up, not with fear, not exactly, but with the particular physical certainty that precedes knowing, the body registering a truth before the mind catches up. Inside the container, under 3 centimeters of loose packing material that had been arranged to look like geological cores if you lifted the lid only slightly and did not look closely, was a child. She was small. I have no way to specify further, because The Meridian lawyers and their species classification experts later made much of the impossibility of accurately gauging the developmental stage of an Orathi minor without formal biological assessment. But I will tell you what I saw. She was small in the way that a child is small, proportioned and finished and complete in miniature, and she was curled on her side in that container with her knees drawn up and her hands tucked under her chin, and she was alive because I could see the faint pulse of bioluminescence at her collar line. A rhythm, slow and faint, the light barely visible in the cold of the bay. Her skin was pale, the color of early morning ice on the Vithran fields I used to survey, and her eyes were closed, and she was making that sound with each exhale, ragged and high and thin, because the container temperature had dropped while the processor cycled, and she was cold. I stood there for a long moment. Then I took off my outer thermal jacket and I put it in the container around her, and then I picked her up, jacket and all, and I carried her out of Bay 7. I did not file a discovery report. I want to say this clearly. I knew I should. The correct protocol for discovering an undocumented biological entity in a cargo container at a colonial waste station is a 6-step discovery and notification procedure that ends with a holding request to the nearest colonial authority office. I knew every step of that procedure. I had administered 2 of them in 11 years, both involving escaped survey fauna from breached research containers, and both times the colonial authority had responded within 48 hours to collect the fauna and file the appropriate transit violation against the hauling company. I did not file the report because, and this is the honest answer, the one I gave the arbitration board under oath, the one that made the Meridian lawyers write things on their notepads, because I stood in the corridor outside Bay 7 with a small alien child wrapped in my thermal jacket, and I thought about the colonial authority response protocols, and about Charter 9, and about what happened to undocumented biological entities that arrived at cold margin waste stations without species classification paperwork. And I decided that I was going to need more information before I invited anyone else into this situation. I carried her to my quarters. I turned the heat up to maximum. I sat in the chair next to my bunk and I held her, jacket and all, and I waited. Her eyes opened at approximately 5:20. They were silver, not gray, not a gray that could be called silver in certain lights, but actual silver, the color of polished survey instruments, with a ring of faint luminescence around the iris that pulsed in the same slow rhythm as the bioluminescence at her collar. She looked at me. I looked at her. I was aware that I was a large, strange, mammalian creature holding her in a chair in a room that smelled like coffee and machine oil and old survey reports, and that she had woken from something very close to a cold margin hypothermic episode inside a sealed container, and that the available evidence suggested she had been put in that container by someone who either wanted her to arrive at her destination unseen or wanted her to not arrive at all. She looked at me for a long time, then she pressed her forehead against my wrist. I do not know enough about Orathi biology or social behavior to explain what that gesture meant within her species framework. I know what it did to me, which was to make it very clear that I was not going to be filing any discovery reports today. Her name, or at least the sound that she made when I pointed to her, after several tries at establishing that mutual pointing was a useful communication framework, was something close to vassal. I could not produce the precise phoneme at the end of it. She accepted vassal. She said it back to me when I pointed to myself and said thresh, and she got it on the first attempt, which was more than Petra had managed in 3 months when she first arrived at the station. I spent the first day managing the things that had to be managed. I told Marin that Bay 7's processor had been logged and that Yusuf should run a full exchanger replacement before the next transit cycle. I signed the outgoing manifests for the Andrax line departure, which included the container, now empty of its original contents, relabeled as damaged in transit and staged for return processing, which is a standard procedure that generates almost no follow-up, and which I was able to initiate without flagging anything unusual to the Colonial Authority automated logging system. I processed the morning communications burst. I ate lunch in the manifest room and told no one anything. That evening, I brought Vassal to Haverock's maintenance tunnel network. The tunnels are not a comfortable place. They run through the station's structural frame, primarily for access to the atmospheric processors and the thermal conduits, and they are not designed for habitation. Low overhead, inadequate lighting, the constant background noise of the processor fans. But they are the one part of Haverock that does not appear on the official station schematic filed with the Colonial Authority, because they were added in a structural reinforcement 17 years before I arrived, and the schematic was never updated, and they are accessible only through maintenance hatches that are not labeled on the exterior. I knew them well because Yusuf, and I had spent several winters crawling through them to reach frozen conduit sections. I made Vassal a space in the widest section, near the thermal conduit junction, where the residual heat from the processors made it warmer than anywhere else in the tunnels. I brought bedding and food from the commissary. I did not know what Orathi physiology could metabolize, but she accepted water immediately and small amounts of the processed protein rations, and a piece of dried fruit that Cassidy kept for her own use that I took without explaining why, which Cassidy accepted with the equanimity she applied to everything. I brought a lamp. I brought 2 extra blankets. I left my thermal jacket. I went back to the manifest room and I sat at my desk and I thought about Charter 9. Corridor Charter 9 is the Colonial Authority's framework for biological entities discovered in transit within the Surath Corridor's legally ambiguous territory. It had been drafted 40 years ago to address the problem of alien fauna smuggling, live specimen transport without the appropriate biological survey certification. And it was still, in the winter of my 41st year, the operating framework because nobody had gotten around to revising it. Charter 9's classification system was built on the premise that biological entities in unauthorized transit fell into 2 categories: certified, possessing valid species survey documentation and species sentience classification, or unprocessed, lacking same. Certified entities had defined legal status. Unprocessed entities were classified as biological inventory pending processing, meaning, in practical terms, that they could be held, transported, and transferred to certified biological processing facilities by any licensed charter authority agent operating under a valid biological recovery contract. Meridian Reclamation Authority held a valid biological recovery contract for the Surath Corridor. They had held it for 7 years. They were, by the letter of Charter 9, authorized to recover any unprocessed biological entity discovered within the corridor's ambiguous territory and transport it to their designated processing facility for species assessment and classification. I knew this. I had known it in an abstract way for years, the way you know things that are true about the legal framework you operate inside without those truths ever becoming relevant to your actual life. Sitting at my desk that evening, they became relevant. I opened my comm terminal, and I ran a search on Meridian Reclamation Authority's processing facility records, public filings, which are accessible under the corridor's information transparency provisions. It took me 40 minutes to find what I was looking for, because it was buried in the facility quarterly capacity reports rather than in the intake summary documents where you would expect to find it. What I found was that Meridian's processing facility had a current species assessment backlog of approximately 14 months, during which time unprocessed biological inventory was held in Meridian's transit holding system. I found 4 separate complaints filed with the Colonial Authority Arbitration Office over the previous 3 years about conditions in Meridian's transit holding. 3 of them had been dismissed on procedural grounds. 1 was still pending. I sat with that for a long time, Then I turned off the terminal and went back to the maintenance tunnels. Vassal was awake. She had rearranged the blankets into a configuration that suggested some innate structural preference I could not fully follow, and she was sitting at the edge of the lamp's light doing something with her hands that I could not identify. A slow, deliberate movement, fingers tracing patterns in the air, the bioluminescence at her collar pulsing faintly in rhythm with it. She stopped when I came in and looked at me with those silver eyes, and I sat down on the tunnel floor next to her, which was not comfortable with my back and my knee, and I stayed until she was asleep. She slept pressed against my side, with her forehead against my wrist, the way she had the first time. I sat in that tunnel for 2 hours after she fell asleep, and I thought about nothing in particular, which is the honest answer. Petra knocked on my office door at 7:30 on Thursday morning. Petra Solen was 26, as I said, and she had a surveying background like mine. She had done 2 years of field certification before coming to Haverock, and she was competent in the specific way that field workers become competent, which is to say she was good at improvising and bad at suffering fools. She had a direct gaze that I had found disconcerting when she first arrived and had come to rely on. She knocked on the door and came in when I said so, and she sat in the chair across my desk, and she put both hands flat on the surface and said, "There's a child in the maintenance tunnels." I looked at her. "I want to check the conduit junction readings at 600, she said, "and I found bedding and a lamp and food and a child." I said, "What did you do?" "I went back to the ladder," Petra said, "and I came here." I told her everything. It took about 20 minutes. Petra did not interrupt me, which was not her usual approach to a conversation. She listened with her hands still flat on the desk, and when I finished she said, "Charter 9. Yes. Meridian. Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" I want to note that she did not say, "This is not our problem." She did not say, "You should have filed the discovery report." She did not say, "Do you understand the legal exposure you are currently carrying?" I was aware that all 3 of those things were true and applicable, and that Petra was certainly aware of them as well, and she said none of them. She said, "What do you need?" 26 years old, 2 years out of field certification, and she already understood something about the shape of the decision I had made that some people never figure out in a lifetime. I told her what I needed. I needed to know how Vassal had arrived, specifically, who had put her in that container and why, and what that implied about who might be looking for her. I needed to know whether there was anything in the Orathi species literature that could help me understand what her presence at a cold margin way station in an unauthorized container meant in terms of her specific circumstances. And I needed to manage the next 24 hours at the station without anything flagging to the Colonial Authority automated systems. Petra spent the rest of Thursday doing the first 2. I spent it doing the third. What Petra found about the Orathi is this. They are a small species, small in numbers, meaning perhaps 40,000 individuals spread across 3 settled worlds and a collection of transit communities in the Surath corridor's outer margin. They had been contacted formally by the Colonial Authority 60 years ago and had been through 2 rounds of species survey and certification before the Colonial Authority had settled on a classification system that placed them at level 3 on the Sentience Assessment Index. Which sounds significant until you understand that the index's level 3 designation comes with the provision that level 3 certification applies to the species collectively, but that individual members, particularly those below developmental threshold, are subject to re-evaluation on a case-by-case basis under Charter 9's unprocessed biological inventory protocols. It is the sort of bureaucratic architecture that you can build for many reasons, and the most charitable interpretation of it is that it was a product of genuine complexity and imperfect science, and the least charitable is that someone, 40 years ago, found it useful to have a mechanism by which individual Orathi could be classified as unprocessed inventory regardless of the species' collective sentience designation. What this meant for Vassal was that she was, under Charter 9, classifiable as unprocessed biological inventory regardless of what I or anyone else who had spent 10 minutes with her might think about her demonstrable capacity for communication, environmental adaptation, and the deliberate rearrangement of blankets into structurally sound sleeping configurations. What Petra found about the container was harder. The Andrax line was a legitimate commercial hauler, but its manifest for the batch reference 7741C had been falsified. The geological cores listed did not match any active survey contract in the Colonial Authority's open database, which Petra found by spending 4 hours cross-referencing batch references against the survey licensing records. The container's origin point, before it entered the Andrax line manifest, was listed as a transfer station in the corridor's outer margin called Verith Junction, which I knew by name only as a small waypoint with a reputation for flexible documentation standards. What any of that meant about who had put Vassal in the container, and why, Petra could not determine from the available public records. It could mean that someone was smuggling her, moving her without authorization for reasons that might range from malicious to desperate. It could mean that someone who knew what Charter 9 meant for an unprocessed Orathi minor had tried to move her through legitimate transit channels using falsified documentation, because it was the only way they could think of to get her somewhere safe. Both explanations were consistent with the available evidence. I thought about that for a long time. Then Yusuf came to find me to tell me the replacement heat exchanger part had finally arrived on the afternoon supply run, and I spent 2 hours helping him install it in Bay 7, which is not how I had planned to spend my Thursday afternoon, but which turned out to be useful, because physical work has always been the environment in which I think most clearly. By the time we finished the installation, I had made a decision, and the decision was this. I was not going to file a discovery report, and I was not going to contact the Colonial Authority, and I was not going to allow Charter 9 to determine what happened next to the small silver-eyed child sleeping in my maintenance tunnels. I am aware that this decision was illegal. I was aware of it at the time. I want to be precise about this because the Meridian lawyers and certain Colonial Authority officials later characterized my actions as the product of ignorance or confusion about the applicable legal framework, and I want to correct that characterization. I was not ignorant. I understood the legal framework thoroughly. I made the decision I made in full understanding of what the framework said and what it meant, and I made it because I had concluded that the framework was wrong. I went to the tunnels after supper. Vassal was awake, doing the hand pattern thing again. I sat with her and I watched, and after a while I understood, or thought I understood, that the patterns were not random. They were repetitive in a way that suggested either habit or language or some overlap of the two, the fingers tracing shapes that had a grammar I could not decode but could recognize as having a grammar. She was not playing. She was practicing something, or saying something, or maintaining something. I could not tell which, and she could not tell me, because we had perhaps 60 shared signals at this point in our mutual communication project, most of them pointing-based, and the hand patterns were outside that vocabulary. She showed me one of them. She traced a shape in the air slowly, watching my face, and then she pointed at me and traced it again, and then she pointed at herself and traced it again and looked at me to see if I had understood. I had not understood. I told her so by the method we had developed for this, which was to shake my head once and look at my hands. She made a small sound that I had come to understand as patience, not frustration, patience, the sound of a person willing to try again from a different direction, and she took my hand carefully, and she guided my fingers through the shape. It is a Orathi gesture that I later learned, from a species studies paper that Petra found for me, is called something roughly translatable as witnessed or known or seen fully. a concept that does not have a clean single-word English equivalent because it means something closer to. I have looked at you completely, and I understand what you are, and you are real to me. Children use it with adults who have cared for them. It is significant in Orathi's social framework in a way that takes some explaining, but the short version is that it is not given casually. She guided my fingers through the shape, and then she pointed at me, and she made the gesture with her own hands, and she looked at me with those silver eyes. I sat there in the maintenance tunnel on the floor with my bad knee aching, and I thought, nobody has looked at me completely and told me I am real to them in a very long time. I made the gesture back. I did not know what it meant yet. I made it back because she had made it to me, and it seemed important not to leave it unanswered. She pressed her forehead against my wrist and went asleep. The Meridian Reclamation Authority Vessel Compliance 3 arrived at Haverock Way Station at 6:10 on Friday morning. I know that this sounds like a close thing, that they arrived on Friday, which was only 2 days after I found her, and you might wonder whether they were already coming before she arrived, or whether the falsified container manifest had flagged somewhere in their monitoring systems, or whether someone at Verith Junction had filed a report. I do not know the answer to that. What I know is that Compliance 3 was in our approach corridor at 6:10, requesting docking clearance under a standard commercial docking protocol, and that the routine background check I ran on their vessel registration returned the Meridian Reclamation Authority designation and a current active biological recovery contract for the Surath corridor. I stood in the manifest room and I looked at that registration return for about 30 seconds. Then I cleared them for docking bay 3, which is the farthest bay from the maintenance tunnel access points. They sent 2 people through the docking connection. A recovery agent named Falcourt, male, heavyset, the particular bureaucratic bulk of a man who has done this job long enough to believe it is simply paperwork, and a compliance officer named Steen, who was younger and who carried a scanning device and a certified copy of Charter 9 printed on formal colonial authority stationery. They came to the manifest room, which is where station visitors are received, and Steen presented the compliance documentation while Falcourt stood to one side and looked at the bay camera feeds on the wall display. The documentation was, as I had known it would be, entirely in order. Steen had a seizure authorization referencing the falsified container manifest. They had clearly traced the same documentation chain that Petra had traced, or had been given a starting point that led them to it. And the seizure authorization was endorsed by the Colonial Authority's Surath Corridor Regional Office under Charter 9's provision for recovery of unprocessed biological inventory discovered in unauthorized transit. It had a case number and a filing date, and the 3 required authorization signatures and a detailed description of the subject. 1 Orathi minor, unclassified developmental stage, unprocessed biological inventory status, recovery priority level 2. We'll need access to your full station, Steen said. All compartments, including utility and maintenance areas. I looked at the documentation. I looked at Steen. I looked at Falcourt, who was still watching the bay feeds. Then I looked back at Steen. I need to review the authorization documentation, I said. That's my right under Corridor Way Station Protocol 7, Section 4. Any recovery operation on a way station requires the station operator to conduct a 20-minute review of authorization materials before granting access. Steen blinked. That's a 20-minute review, I said. Section 4. Way Station Protocol 7, Section 4 is real. It is buried in the Surath Corridor Administrative Code in a section that nobody reads because nobody has needed it in 20 years. I had read it 11 years ago when I first arrived at Haverock and had been working my way through the full administrative code as a means of understanding the operational framework I was responsible for, and I had never once expected to use it. I had also, since 610, been on the station intercom to Petra. Petra spent those 20 minutes moving Vassal. She moved her from the maintenance tunnel to a location I am not going to specify, even in this account 20 years later, because the specific location involves a structural feature of Haverock that the rebuilt station still has, and that I see no reason to advertise in a public document. What matters is that Vassal was moved, and that she went with Petra without sound and without resistance, which suggested either that she understood what was happening or that she trusted Petra enough not to need to understand it. Either interpretation is, I think, to her considerable credit. I reviewed the authorization documentation for 20 minutes. Then I granted Meridian access to the station. They searched for 2 hours. They found nothing. Steen's scanning device was calibrated for Orathi biological signature detection, which I know because she told me so during the search, perhaps thinking the information would pressure me, or perhaps simply as a conversational fill, the way people talk during searches, and she ran it through every accessible compartment on the station. The device presumably returned nothing, or nothing she could act on. Falcourt, toward the end of the search, stood in the manifest room and looked at me. "Operator," he said. "Thresh," I said. "Thresh." He had a flat way of speaking, the register of a man who has said the same things in the same tone to enough people that all variation has worn smooth. "You understand what you're doing." "I understand what I'm doing. Charter 9 is clear." "I've read Charter 9. "Then you know that harboring unprocessed biological inventory is a charter violation carrying suspension of operating license, personal liability assessment up to 100,000 colonial credits, and potential criminal referral under the Corridor Transit Authority Act." "I know what it carries." He looked at me. I looked at him. There was nothing aggressive in his manner and nothing aggressive in mine. We were 2 men of similar age having a clear-eyed conversation about consequences, and I think he was genuinely trying to give me an off-ramp. The tone was not threatening but informational, the tone of a man who finds it cleaner when people choose the path that doesn't require additional paperwork. "I don't have anything for you today," I said. He held my gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once and went to collect Steen, and they returned to Compliance 3 and departed at 10:23. I went to the commissary and I sat at the table, and Cassidy put a cup of coffee in front of me without being asked, and sat down across from me and said, "How long do you think you have?" "I don't know," I said. "I'll start going through my personal supply caches," Cassidy said. "She seems to like the dried fruit." I looked at her. "I'm 64, Cassidy said, "and I've been at this station longer than you have, and I know what I am and what I'm not, and I'm not someone who pretends a child in a box is a paperwork problem." She picked up her own coffee. "What do you need?" What I needed, and what I did not yet know I had the means to obtain, was a species sentience assessment. A formal one, conducted by a certified colonial authority assessor, resulting in a documented level 4 or higher classification for Vassal specifically, not just for Orathi as a species. Level 4 individual classification would remove her from Charter 9's unprocessed biological inventory provision entirely, and give her the status of a recognized sentient individual, at which point Meridian seizure authorization would be void, and the colonial authorities' legal framework would require them to treat her as a person rather than as inventory. The problem was that certified colonial authority species assessors are not common in the cold margin of the Surath corridor. There was one assessor with active corridor accreditation, a woman named Dr. Yale Mordecai, based at Surath Central, who traveled the corridor quarterly on a circuit that included way station stops, but whose next scheduled visit to Haverock was 9 weeks away. 9 weeks was not a timeline I could reasonably manage, particularly given that Meridian's Compliance 3 had now logged a station search at Haverock that would generate a follow-up visit when the search returned no result. Petra, who had spent Thursday night reading the Colonial Authority Administrative Code at my suggestion, found the relevant provision on Friday afternoon. The Corridor Transit Authority Act, Section 11, Subsection 7. In cases where an unprocessed biological entity is in active custody dispute between a way station operator and a licensed recovery authority, either party may request an emergency sentience assessment, which the Colonial Authority is obligated to schedule within 72 hours of receipt of the formal request. The catch, and there was always a catch in the Colonial Authority's administrative code, was that the request had to be filed by the station operator under oath, with a sworn declaration that the entity was in the station operator's lawful care and custody at the time of filing, which meant declaring that I had vassal at the station, which meant Charter 9's clock started running the moment I filed. I thought about that for a while, then I filed the request. I filed it at 15:47 on Friday afternoon, with Petra witnessing the oath declaration and Cassidy co-signing as a secondary station staff witness, as permitted under the protocol. The filing formally declared that I had in my care and custody one Orathi minor of unspecified developmental stage, that she was in a state of adequate health, and that I was contesting Meridian Reclamation Authorities' Charter 9 seizure authorization on the grounds that the entity demonstrated sufficient individual sentience markers to warrant formal assessment prior to any recovery action. I sent a copy of the filing to Meridian's registered administrative address simultaneously. The Colonial Authority's automated system sent me a confirmation and a preliminary scheduling notice within 6 hours. Dr. Yale Mordecai would conduct the emergency assessment at Haverock Way Station within the stipulated 72-hour window. Then I sent a copy of the filing to every Colonial Authority office, advocacy organization, and independent legal review body, with a registered address in the Sureth corridor that Petra and I could identify in the public directory, 47 separate organizations, which is a number I find satisfying in retrospect given how many transits Haverock processed in an average month. I did not do this on the advice of counsel. I did not have counsel. I did it because I had spent 30 years in the Colonial Authority's administrative systems, and I knew that the best protection for a single way station operator contesting a licensed recovery authority's seizure order was not legal argument but visibility, and that visibility required as many people as possible to know the filing existed before Meridian could respond to it. Solt, when I explained what I had done, said, "That's going to make them angry." "Yes," I said. "And they're going to come back before the 72 hours. "Probably. So what do we do?" I thought about what we were. 6 people on a cold margin way station with inadequate heating and a manifest room that smelled like stale coffee and a maintenance tunnel network that wasn't on the official schematic. A surveyor with a bad back and a bad knee. A 26-year-old field-certified second-in-command who had asked, "What do you need?" before she asked anything else. An atmospheric processor technician who kept an aging system functional through stubbornness. 2 cargo handlers who had not, when it came to it, asked me any questions I could not answer. An old woman who had been at the station longer than any of us and who had already started going through her personal caches for dried fruit. "We do our jobs," I said. "And we don't open the door until we're required to." Compliance 3 returned at 8:30 on Saturday morning, which was 39 hours after my filing and therefore inside the 72-hour emergency assessment window during which, under Section 11 subsection 7, Meridian was required to suspend active recovery operations pending assessment outcome. They did not suspend. They filed their own counter-documentation with the Colonial Authority, claiming that my custody declaration was invalid because I had failed to report discovery within the mandatory 24-hour window under Charter 9, making my subsequent custody claim legally deficient. This was a reasonable legal argument. Their lawyers were not wrong about the 24-hour reporting requirement. What they had not accounted for, or what they had perhaps not expected me to have accounted for, was Section 4, Subsection 12 of the Corridor Transit Authority Act, which provides that a station operator's failure to file a timely discovery report does not invalidate a subsequent custody declaration if the operator can demonstrate that the delay was motivated by reasonable concern for the biological entity's safety. Demonstrating that was not difficult, given that I had spent Friday afternoon pulling Meridian's public facility records and the 4 complaints filed with the Colonial Authority Arbitration Office, 3 of which had been dismissed and 1 of which was still pending. I had filed those records as exhibits with my original declaration. Steen came to the manifest room at 8:45. She was alone this time. Falcourt was presumably managing the docking connection and the communication logs. She sat down across the desk from me, and she put her hands flat on the surface, the same way Petra had on Thursday morning, and she said, "Thresh." "Steen," I said, "this is not going to end the way you think it's going to end. Tell me how it's going to end." She looked at me. She was, I thought, not a bad person. She was a person doing a job that she had probably come to the way most people come to jobs, a series of reasonable decisions that aggregate over time into something you would not have chosen from the outside. She had the particular tiredness of someone who has had a version of this conversation before and has learned to expect a specific ending. "The assessment will classify her," Steen said. "Maybe level 3, which doesn't change anything. Maybe level 4, but Meridian will contest it. There are established legal challenges to emergency assessments conducted under Section 11. The assessment window is too short for rigorous evaluation. We've successfully challenged 4 of them in the last 2 years. Either way, by the time any final determination comes through, the counterfiling will have vacated your custody declaration. And at that point you have a paper problem," I said, "and she still has to be somewhere physically while the paper problem works itself out." Steen stopped. "She has to be somewhere," I said. "That's true whether your counterfiling succeeds or not, whether the assessment goes your way or not, whether my custody declaration stands or gets vacated. Physically in space, in a station or a facility or a transit hold, she has to be somewhere. And right now she is somewhere. She is here, and she is warm and fed, and she knows the people around her. And I am not going to tell you where specifically because I am not required to until Dr. Mordecai arrives and the assessment begins. What I am going to tell you is that whatever happens legally, there is a gap between the legal determination and the physical reality, and in that gap someone has to decide what happens to her. And I would like that someone to be me." Steen was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You don't have that right." "I know," I said. "I had it anyway." She left at 9:20. Compliance 3 remained at docking bay 3. Dr. Yale Mordecai arrived in her own vessel at 13:40 on Saturday afternoon. She was a small woman, perhaps 60, with the efficient movements of someone who has spent decades covering large distances in small ships. She came through the docking connection with a single carry case, and she shook my hand and she said, "I read your filing on the way out, all of it including the exhibits." She paused. "Meridian's facility records." "Yes," I said. "The pending complaint." "Yes." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not fully read. Then she said, "Show me the child." I took her to where Vassal was. The assessment took 2 hours and 40 minutes. I was not present for most of it. Dr. Mordecai worked with Vassal alone, which is standard protocol, and I sat outside in the corridor with my back against the wall and my bad knee stretched out and Petra next to me, both of us not talking, which is one of the things I appreciate most about Petra. When Mordecai came out, she had the particular expression of a scientist who has found a result she was hoping for but has not let herself hope for too hard. "The hand patterns," she said, "she showed you." "Yes." "Did she guide your hands through one?" "Yes." Mordecai looked at me for a moment. "You understand that's not." "I know what it means," I said. "I looked it up." Mordecai was quiet. Then, "Level 4 will not be difficult to document. Level 4 is clear and supportable. I can have the formal assessment filed with the colonial authority within 2 hours of leaving here." She paused. "Meridian will contest it." "I know. It will take time, months, possibly longer." "I know that too. She'll need to be somewhere stable during the contest period." I said, "She's here." Mordecai looked at me for a long moment. Then she went back in. She stayed another 20 minutes. When she came out a second time, she had the carry case in one hand and Vassal's hand in the other, and Vassal was looking around the corridor with those silver eyes with the calm, thorough attention that I had come to understand was her default mode of engagement with new environments. Not fear, not anxiety, but a complete and serious looking. She looked at me. She made the gesture, the one she had taught me, the one that means witnessed or known or seen fully. She made it with one hand because the other was in Dr. Mordecai's hand, but she made it whole and deliberate. I made it back. The legal proceedings took 14 months. Meridian contested the assessment as predicted. The Colonial Authority Arbitration Board heard the contest, reviewed Dr. Mordecai's methodology, and found for the assessment. Meridian appealed. The appeal was heard by a 3-judge panel of the Surath Corridor Regional Court, which found against Meridian, with the lead judge writing an opinion that spent 11 paragraphs on the question of what Charter 9's unprocessed biological inventory provision had been designed to accomplish, and whether it had drifted, over 40 years of administrative practice, substantially away from that design. The opinion is not famous. It was a regional court in a legally ambiguous corridor, but it is cited in 4 subsequent Colonial Authority administrative reform proceedings, and Charter 9's individual classification provision has been revised twice since then, both times in the direction of the regional court's reasoning. I did not follow all of this in real time. I had a way station to run. I followed the summary filings that my Colonial Authority-appointed legal representative. I was given one, eventually, which I had not expected, sent me at the conclusion of each stage. At each stage, the result was the same. The assessment stood. Meridian's operating license for biological recovery in the Surath Corridor was reviewed by the Colonial Authority as a consequence of the arbitration proceedings. Specifically, the 4 complaints about facility conditions, including the one that had still been pending when I filed my exhibits, and that was resolved, unfavorably for Meridian, 3 months after my own arbitration concluded. They retained their license, but with substantial operational modifications required. I do not know whether those modifications were sufficient. I hope they were. Vassal was at Haverock through the 14 months of proceedings. She stayed in the maintenance tunnels initially, while Compliance 3 remained at Docking Bay 3, and the legal situation was unresolved. And then in a proper spare quarters room, once the first arbitration ruling came down, and Meridian's active recovery operation was formally suspended pending appeal. Cassidy taught her the commissary routines. Yusuf showed her how the atmospheric processors worked, or tried to. She seemed more interested in the thermal conduit patterns than in the mechanical components, which I do not think Yusuf ever entirely forgave. Solt and Marin taught her 3 card games, 2 of which she learned to win at with a speed that was, I think, slightly unsettling to them. Petra and she developed a communication system that went considerably beyond what Vassal and I had built in those first 3 days. Petra is better at languages than I am, and had access to the Orathi Studies literature, and was 26, and therefore willing to spend hours doing something painstaking and iterative in a way that I, at 41, was somewhat less naturally inclined toward. I taught her, or tried to teach her, the manifest logging system. She was, I think, patient with me in a way that she was not required to be. What I mostly did was be there. I sat with her in the evenings, usually in the manifest room or sometimes in the commissary, and I was there in the way that adults are present with children when they do not have a great deal of language to bridge the gap, a consistent, steady, unremarkable presence. I was not her parent. I was not equipped to be her parent, and I had no illusion that I was. I was the man who had opened a container at 3:40 on a Wednesday morning and made a decision, and who was now present in the daily life of a child who was navigating an environment entirely outside her experience, and I thought the least I could do was be consistently there. She taught me 3 more gestures from the hand pattern vocabulary during those 14 months. The second one I learned means something like here or present or rooted in this place. A grounding gesture, from what I understand, used to indicate that something or someone is exactly where they belong. The third means something I am going to translate, inadequately, as patient, not patience as a passive quality, but as an active one, the decision to remain and wait and trust that what is needed will come. The fourth, the last one she taught me, about 6 weeks before the final appeal ruling came in and about 3 months before she left, I will come back to. Her people came for her 8 months into the proceedings. Once the first arbitration ruling had made her legal status clear enough that the relevant Orathi community authorities felt safe entering the colonial authorities' formal contact channels. There were, it turned out, people who knew where she was and who she was. She had come from a transit community in the corridor's outer margin, and the people who had put her in that container had done so because the legal complexity of moving an Orathi minor through corridor transit legitimately, while Meridian's recovery operations were active, had made the falsified documentation route appear to be the safer option. They had not known she would nearly freeze. I have thought about this many times. I do not know how to feel about it exactly. The people who put her in that container were trying to protect her from the system that was trying to take her, and they miscalculated the physical danger in ways that could have killed her. There is a version of this in which I am very angry at them, and a version in which I understand them, and I live in the uncomfortable territory between those versions. The Orathi community representative who made contact with me was a woman named Ale, or at least that is the closest I can render the sound, and she was careful and formal in our initial communications, and then, as it became clear that I was not going to demand anything from her, gradually less so. We communicated through Petra, mostly, who by that point had enough of the hand pattern vocabulary to serve as a basic interpreter, supplemented by a translation system that the colonial authority provided as part of the legal proceedings framework. From Ale I learned that Vassal was 9 years old by the Orathi developmental calendar, which does not map directly onto a human age equivalent, but is, by Orathi social reckoning, a specific developmental stage that carries specific community obligations and expectations, none of which had been met in the circumstances that had brought her to my maintenance tunnel. From Ale I learned that the gesture I had learned first, the one Vassal had guided my hands through, the one that means witnessed or known or seen fully, is given by Orathi children to adults who have fulfilled a specific protective role in circumstances of need, and that the giving of it is, in Orathi social terms, a formal acknowledgement that carries obligations in both directions. I did not know what to do with this information initially. Then I decided that what to do with it was to be worthy of the acknowledgement, which I was already trying to do, and so nothing needed to change. The appeal ruling came down 14 months after I had filed my custody declaration. I was in the manifest room when Petra came in with the filing summary on her comm unit. She put it in front of me without saying anything. I read it. The appeal was denied. The assessment stood. Vassal's individual level 4 classification was confirmed. Meridian's seizure authorization was formally voided. The lead judge's opinion on the Charter 9 provision was in the filing summary's appendix. I read the filing summary twice, then I went to find Vassal. She was in the commissary with Cassidy, learning, or possibly teaching, something that involved small objects arranged on the table in a pattern. Cassidy, who was not a woman given to displays of much, was laughing at something. It was 9:40 in the morning, and the light through the commissary's small viewport was the particular silver gray of cold margin morning, and it was very quiet, and I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at them. Vassal saw me. She looked at my face. She made the fourth gesture, the last one she had taught me, the one I am coming to now. I learned it from her 6 weeks before she left, in the manifest room in the evening. She had been doing the hand patterns the way she sometimes did when she was thinking through something, and she stopped and looked at me and made a gesture I had not seen before, a different movement, slower and more deliberate than the others, the hands coming together in a particular configuration and then opening outward. She made it and she looked at me and waited. I did not know it. I told her so by the method we used. She made the gesture again, slowly, and then she pointed at me, at herself, at Cassidy through the wall in the direction of the commissary, at the floor of the station, at everything, gesture spreading outward, hands opening wide. The translation, which I later confirmed with Ale, is something like changed by or made different by or, and this is the translation that has stayed with me in the 20 years since, not what I was because of this. She made the gesture and she looked at me and she waited, and I made it back because it was true. Ale came to Haverock in person 3 months after the final ruling, with a small delegation and a transit vessel with legitimate documentation and no falsified manifest. Vassal had known they were coming for several weeks. We had been communicating through Petra and the translation system, and Petra had made sure she understood what the ruling meant and what came next. She was, as far as I could tell, ready. She was 9 years old by a reckoning I did not fully understand, and she had spent 14 months in a cold margin way station learning card games and atmospheric processor theory, and the manifest logging system, and the hand pattern words for what it means to be seen fully and to be changed by something, and to belong exactly where you are. The morning Ale's vessel docked, I went to the maintenance tunnel, not because she was in the maintenance tunnel anymore, but because it was where this had started and it seemed like the right place to stand for a moment. The thermal conduit junction was warm the way it always was, and it smelled like processor oil and old air, and the lamp bracket I had installed for her was still on the wall. When I came back out, the delegation was in the docking corridor, and Vassal was standing at the edge of what I had started thinking of, without saying it out loud, as her territory, the corridor between the commissary and the manifest room that she had claimed over 14 months by the simple repeated fact of being there. Ale was speaking with her. Vassal was answering. I did not understand most of it. My hand pattern vocabulary was real but limited, and they were moving faster than my reading speed. But I understood the shape of it, which was the shape of a reunion and a reckoning and a beginning of a new thing, all at once. Cassidy was next to me. She had a cup of coffee in each hand, and she gave me one without looking at me. Vassal turned at some point and walked over to where I was standing. She stood in front of me. She was, as I have said, small in the way that 9-year-old children are small by any species reckoning, small enough that looking at her directly meant looking down. She looked up at me with those silver eyes with the luminescent rings, and she made 3 gestures. The first one she had taught me, the one that means witnessed or known or seen fully. The third one, the one that means patient, the active patience, the decision to remain and trust. And the fourth one, not what I was because of this. I made them back, all 3 in the same order as carefully as I could. She pressed her forehead against my wrist one last time. Then she went with Ale. I ran Haverock for another 6 years after that. The colonial authority reviewed my operating license as part of the arbitration follow-up and found, ultimately, that the mitigating factors in my custody declaration, specifically the safety concerns documented in the facility complaint records, warranted a resolution of the license review without suspension or penalty, which is a bureaucratic way of saying they decided not to punish me and needed a reason. I accepted the reason they offered. Petra took over the station when I left, which was the right outcome. The Orathi community sent a formal acknowledgement to Haverock Way Station 8 months after Vassal left. I still have it in the same binder as the original transit manifest from the Andrax line, batch reference 7740-1C. It is written in a combination of colonial standard and Orathi hand pattern notation, which means I can read approximately a third of it without help, and I have had the rest translated twice. Once officially, once by Petra, and I trust Petra's version more. What it says, in Petra's translation, is essentially this: that Vassal had been returned and that she was well, and that the community wished to record formally that the station operator at Haverock Way Station had fulfilled the obligations that come with being witnessed. I have thought about that a lot in 20 years, the obligations that come with being witnessed. I did not know, when I opened that container at 3:40 on a Wednesday morning, that I was going to rearrange myself. I had a life that fit the shape I had made for it, and I was not looking for it to change, and I did not feel in the moment like a man at any kind of turning point. I felt like a man with a bad knee and a cold cup of coffee who had broken a survey seal because a sound in a cold cargo bay had made the hair on his forearm stand up. What the small one taught me about being human is not one thing. It is not a lesson you can put in a sentence, though people have asked me to put it in a sentence, and I understand why. A sentence is portable and a life is not. If I had to try, I would say this. I had spent 30 years believing that the systems I operated inside were, on balance, adequate. Not perfect, I was not naive, but adequate. Built by people attempting something reasonable, tending toward outcomes that were more often acceptable than not. I had spent 30 years living inside that belief the way you live inside a building without examining the walls. And then I stood in a cargo bay at 3:40 with a sound I could not classify filling the air around me, and I opened the container, and I found out that the walls I had been living inside were not walls I was willing to live inside anymore. That is not comfortable knowledge. It requires you to do things afterward that are inconvenient and legally complicated, and that make people in Meridian's administrative offices write things on their notepads. It requires you to sit on the floor of a maintenance tunnel with a bad knee because that is where the child is, and you have decided to be where the child is. It requires you to break things you have spent 30 years not breaking. Seals, protocols, the comfortable fiction that the paperwork is always, ultimately, going to be enough. She taught me that I was not, in fact, someone who believed the paperwork was enough. I had thought I was. I was wrong. She taught me what I actually believed, which turned out to be this: that a child is not inventory, that a pair of silver eyes pressing open in the cold of a cargo bay at 3:40 is a fact that supersedes a charter provision. That when something looks at you and guides your hands through the shape of I have seen you fully, you are changed by it whether or not you were looking to change. I was not what I was because of her. I think that is the most true thing I know about what it is to be human. Not the biology, not the technical definition, not the species assessment criteria that Dr. Mordecai would document and that the regional court would uphold. The most true thing is this: we are capable of being changed by something small, and sometimes we are changed in ways that make us better than we were. And the thing that changed us is not always the thing we expected, and is almost never convenient, and is nearly always, in the end, worth it. That is what she taught me. That is the only version of the lesson I can offer. It will have to be enough.